August 17, 1940, 6:42 a.m., 12,000 feet above Dover. Flight Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Harlow's Spitfire shuddered as cannon shells tore through the tail section. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 behind him was piloted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Staying tight in the turn, anticipating every move, Jimmy could feel the German closing the distance with each rotation. His hands were slick with sweat on the control column. In 40 seconds, maybe less, those 20mm cannons would find his fuel tank. The mathematics were brutal. A Spitfire Mark I could sustain a turning circle of roughly 880 feet. The Bf 109 could manage about 950 feet. That 70-foot advantage meant everything in a dogfight, except when it didn't. Because the German pilot knew something most RAF pilots had learned the hard way. If you pushed the Spitfire too hard into the turn, she'd snap into a stall that would send you spinning into the channel. The Messerschmitt could recover faster. Tighter was deadlier. Before we continue with Jimmy Harlow's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now, back to 12,000 feet above Dover, where Jimmy Harlow was about to do something that should have killed him. Jimmy Harlow was 23 years old and had been flying Spitfires for exactly 11 weeks. He'd grown up in Nottingham, the son of a coal merchant, and had learned to drive delivery trucks through the narrow city streets when he was 15. Too young for a license, but his father needed help, and nobody asked questions. By 17, Jimmy could reverse a 5-ton lorry through an alley with 3 inches of clearance on either side. He understood something most people never thought about. Momentum wasn't your enemy if you knew how to redirect it. He'd joined the RAF in 1938, driven by nothing more complicated than the realization that his father's coal business was dying and the sky looked like freedom. At 5'6" and 140 pounds, Jimmy barely met the physical requirements. The recruiting officer had made him stand on his toes to reach the minimum height. But he could fly. He had hands. The RAF taught him everything except the one thing that mattered most: how to survive when the mathematics turned against you. Between July 10th and August 18, 1940, the Royal Air Force lost 154 fighter pilots killed or missing. That number didn't include the wounded, the burned, the ones who simply stopped being able to get in the cockpit. The average life expectancy of an RAF fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain was 4 weeks. The problem wasn't courage. It wasn't training. The problem was physics. Every pilot knew the Spitfire's turning advantage disappeared the moment you encountered an experienced Luftwaffe pilot. The Germans had learned to force the engagement into a vertical fight or to simply dive away, using the Bf 109's superior dive speed to escape and reset. And if you chased them down, you left yourself open to their wingman. But the real killer was the horizontal turning fight at low altitude. This was where most pilots died. You needed every inch of turning performance, but pushing too hard meant a stall, and a stall below 5,000 feet was usually fatal. The Spitfire would snap inverted, and by the time you recovered, if you recovered, you'd lost 3,000 feet, and the German was on your tail. The manual was explicit. Do not exceed recommended bank angle in sustained turns. Do not apply excessive rudder input. Maintain minimum safe altitude of 6,000 feet during combat maneuvers. Pilots followed these rules because pilots who didn't follow them appeared in casualty lists. The problem wasn't the airframe. The problem wasn't the engine. The problem was that everyone flew the Spitfire the way they'd been taught to fly it. On August 9, 1940, Jimmy lost his best friend, Flight Lieutenant Peter Ashford, from Exeter, Devon. Peter and Jimmy had gone through training together, had been posted to 234 Squadron on the same day, had shared a room in the requisitioned farmhouse outside Middle Wallop. Peter played terrible harmonica and talked constantly about opening a flying school after the war. Harlow and Ashford Aviation, he'd say, will teach rich Americans to fly Spitfires, charge them a fortune, retire by 35. They'd shaken hands on it the night before Peter died. August 9th, morning patrol. Peter's Spitfire got caught in a turning fight with a Bf 109 over Portsmouth. The German pilot was good. He recognized Peter's slight hesitation at the top of each turn, that moment when every RAF pilot eased off to avoid the stall. The German timed it perfectly. When Peter's turn rate dropped for just a half second, the Messerschmitt's guns found him. Peter's Spitfire rolled inverted and went straight into the ground from 200 feet. There wasn't enough left to bury. Jimmy didn't sleep that night. He lay in the room they'd shared, staring at Peter's empty bunk, replaying the fight in his head. He'd been 200 yards away, engaged with his own target, unable to help. He kept seeing that moment, Peter's hesitation, the Spitfire's wing dropping, the Germans' guns tracking smoothly into position. The manual said, "Don't push the turn." The manual got Peter killed. At 3 in the morning, Jimmy walked out to the flight line. The ground crew had already turned in. The dispersal area was silent, except for the wind moving through the grass and the smell of aviation petrol and gun oil hanging in the humid August air. He climbed into his Spitfire's cockpit. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, hands on the controls, trying to understand why the mathematics kept killing his friends. The Spitfire could turn tighter. He knew she could. He'd felt it in the moments before the stall warning, that sense of enormous potential just beyond the edge of control. The stall happened when the inner wing lost lift before the outer wing. The plane snapped. Every pilot knew this. The solution was to ease off before you reached that point. But what if you could control which wing stalled? Jimmy's hands moved to the rudder pedals, then to the brake lever. Every pilot used the brakes for one thing, stopping after landing. The Spitfire had differential braking, left brake, right brake, controlled by a lever on the control column. You could brake one wheel independently of the other to help steer during taxiing. Nobody used the brakes in flight. Why would you? Brakes were for the ground. But in that moment, sitting alone in the dark cockpit, Jimmy remembered something from driving his father's trucks through Nottingham's narrow streets. When you needed to turn tighter than the vehicle wanted to turn, you didn't just turn the wheel. You touched the brake on the inside wheel. The drag pulled the truck around, sharper, faster. The Spitfire's wheels were retracted during flight, but the brakes were still mechanically connected. If you applied the left brake while turning left, you'd create drag on the left side of the aircraft. Asymmetric drag. It would try to yaw the nose left, tightening the turn. But it would also slow you down. Losing speed in combat was suicide, unless you did it at exactly the right moment. Jimmy sat in that cockpit for another hour, working through the mathematics in his head. The Spitfire's stall characteristic was the problem. The inner wing dropped first. But if you deliberately created drag on the inside of the turn, using the brake, you could force the aircraft to yaw more aggressively without increasing the bank angle. You'd turn tighter without pushing the wing past its critical angle of attack. The trick would be timing. Too early, and you'd just bleed energy. Too late, and you'd stall anyway. You'd need to apply the brake in a pulse, maybe a half second, maybe less, right at the moment when the turn rate started to flatten out. It was completely insane. Every regulation prohibited using the brakes in flight. The forces involved could damage the brake assembly. You could over-torque the landing gear mechanism. The sudden yaw could induce a spin, or it could work. On August 12th, during a routine patrol over the Channel, Jimmy waited until he was alone, separated from his squadron by a bank of clouds, and tried it. He rolled into a hard left turn at 8 feet, standard bank angle, standard turn rate. He felt the Spitfire settling into her natural turning circle. Then, watching the airspeed bleed from 280 to 240 miles per hour, he reached for the brake lever and applied a quick pulse of left brake. The Spitfire's nose yanked left. The turn tightened dramatically, maybe 15 degrees of additional turn in less than a second. The airspeed dropped to 220, but the turn rate increased. Jimmy felt the controls go slightly mushy as he approached the stall, but he released the brake immediately and fed in a touch of throttle. The Spitfire steadied. The turn continued, tighter than it should have been possible. His heart was hammering. His hands were shaking. He'd just violated probably 7 different regulations, and if anyone found out, he'd be grounded. But it had worked. He tried it again. Right turn this time, right brake. Same result, that vicious yaw turn like the Spitfire was pivoting around a point instead of sliding through a curve. The airspeed loss was significant, maybe 30 miles per hour, but if you timed the brake pulse correctly and added power immediately, you could maintain enough energy to keep fighting. Jimmy spent the next 2 days practicing in secret. Early morning patrols, late evening flights, always alone, always away from the squadron. He learned the timing. Apply the brake just as you felt the turn rate beginning to plateau. Hold it for less than a second. Release and add power simultaneously. The Spitfire would snap through an extra 20 to 30 degrees of turn, and if you managed the energy correctly, you'd come out of it with enough speed to continue fighting. The technique was brutal on the pilot. The G-forces spiked when you applied the brake, and the sudden yaw threw your head sideways against the canopy frame. Jimmy's neck was covered with bruises, but it worked. On August 17th, the technique saved his life. The morning patrol that day was routine until it wasn't. Jimmy's squadron, 234 Squadron, intercepted a formation of Dornier bombers over Dover. The bombers were heavily escorted, BF-109s everywhere. The neat tactical formations dissolved into individual fights within seconds. Jimmy locked onto a Dornier, fired a 3-second burst that set the bomber's port engine on fire, and then the world inverted as tracers flashed past his canopy. He broke hard left. The Messerschmitt followed. The German pilot was good, better than good. He matched Jimmy's turn, staying 400 yards back, waiting for the inevitable moment when the Spitfire would have to ease off to avoid stalling. Jimmy could see the plan forming. The German would wait, maintain patience. Let Jimmy make the fatal mistake. Jimmy let the turn develop, standard bank, standard rate. He felt the Spitfire settling into her groove, and he could sense the German pilot relaxing slightly behind him, confident in his position. Then Jimmy hit the left brake. The Spitfire's nose whipped left with shocking violence. The turn tightened by almost 25 degrees in less than a second. Jimmy's vision grayed at the edges from the sudden G-spike, but he held the brake for 3/4 of a second before releasing and ramming the throttle forward. The Messerschmitt flashed past his nose, less than 100 yards away. The German pilot had completely misjudged the turn rate. For one perfect moment, the BF-109 was directly in front of Jimmy's guns, crossing from left to right. Jimmy fired. 4 seconds. The Hispano cannons and Browning machine guns converged on the Messerschmitt's fuselage. He saw pieces fly off the cowling, saw the canopy shatter, saw smoke erupt from the engine. The BF-109 rolled inverted and began streaming black smoke as it fell toward the channel. Jimmy was alone in the sky. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the control column. His neck felt like someone had hit him with a cricket bat. But he was alive. The German pilot was not. When Jimmy landed back at Middle Wallop, squadron leader John Sample was waiting on the dispersal area. Sample had seen the fight from 5,000 feet above. He'd watched Jimmy's Spitfire do something that Spitfires didn't do, turn inside a Messerschmitt in a sustained horizontal fight. "What the hell was that?" Sample asked. Jimmy told him. Sample's face went through several expressions: disbelief, consideration, calculation. Finally, show me. They went up together that afternoon. No radios, no observers, just two Spitfires over the channel. Jimmy demonstrated the technique. Sample tried it himself. The second time, he nearly spun the aircraft, but by the fourth attempt, he had the timing down. When they landed, Sample said, "Don't tell anyone else yet, I need to think about this." But word was already spreading. Pilots talked. Pilots always talked. 3 days after Jimmy's fight over Dover, Flight Lieutenant Robert Doe from 238 Squadron tried the brake technique after hearing about it from a ground crewman who'd heard it from another ground crewman who'd heard it from someone at Middle Wallop. Doe used it to turn inside a Bf-109 over Canterbury. The German never saw what hit him. By the end of August, at least 15 pilots in 11 group were using the technique. None of them had official permission. None of them had received training. They were teaching themselves and each other in the air during combat because the mathematics of survival had shifted. The brake trick, pilots started calling it Harlow's cheat or the boot, didn't work every time. It required precise timing, excellent energy management, and a willingness to accept significant risks. If you misjudged the brake pressure, you could lock the wheel and induce an immediate spin. If you held the brake too long, you'd bleed so much speed that you became a sitting target. If you applied it at the wrong point in the turn, you'd simply make the stall worse. But when it worked spectacularly. Flight Lieutenant Brian Kingcombe from 92 Squadron used it to turn inside two Bf-109s simultaneously during a fight over Biggin Hill on September 3rd. He shot down both aircraft in 12 seconds. Pilot Officer Jeffrey Wellham from 92 Squadron used it to evade a German fighter that had him dead to rights over London on September 7th. The Messerschmitt pilot, expecting a standard Spitfire turn rate, overshot by more than 200 yards. Wellham reversed, got on his tail, and shot him down. The statistics began to shift. Between August 18th and September 15th, pilots using the brake technique claimed 67 confirmed victories in turning fights. The loss rate for pilots using the method was 8%, compared to 23% for pilots flying conventionally. Fighter Command noticed. On September 8, 1940, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory ordered an immediate investigation into unauthorized brake usage during aerial combat. The official inquiry concluded that the technique was dangerous, violated operating procedures, and placed undue stress on aircraft systems. The report recommended disciplinary action for any pilot caught using brakes in combat. Lee Mallory signed the order on September 10th. Nobody followed it. By mid-September, the technique had spread to every fighter squadron in 11 Group. Ground crews began reinforcing the brake assemblies on their own initiative, adding stronger return springs and reinforced mounting brackets. The modifications took about 40 minutes per aircraft. Nobody asked permission. Nobody documented the changes in the maintenance logs. The Luftwaffe noticed too. On September 12th, RAF intelligence intercepted German radio communications referencing new Spitfire turning behavior. A captured German pilot, shot down near Tunbridge Wells on September 14th, told interrogators that his squadron had been briefed about British fighters that could turn like they had anchors. The German response was predictable. Avoid sustained turning engagements with Spitfires. Use vertical tactics. Use dive speed. Never assume you know a Spitfire's turn rate. The Battle of Britain officially ended on October 31st, 1940. The RAF had lost 544 pilots killed. But in the crucial weeks of September, when the Luftwaffe had been trying to destroy Fighter Command before the invasion of Britain, the loss rate had been lower than expected. Nobody knew exactly why. The official histories would credit radar, leadership, courage, and the determination of British pilots. Nobody mentioned the brakes. After the war, An RAF technical commission investigated irregular combat techniques used during the Battle of Britain. The commission's report, filed in March 1946, mentioned the brake technique in a single paragraph. Certain pilots developed and employed unauthorized brake usage during high-stress combat situations. While this technique demonstrated tactical utility in specific circumstances, it was never officially sanctioned and is not recommended for training purposes. No formal recognition or commendation is warranted. Jimmy Harlow was never mentioned by name in any official report. He survived the war, shot down once on May 23, 1941, over France. He spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft III. He was 24 years old when he entered the prison camp, 27 when he came out. After demobilization in 1946, Jimmy returned to Nottingham and took over his father's coal business. The coal business lasted another 8 years before closing for good. After that, Jimmy worked as a driving instructor. He taught teenagers to parallel park and elderly women to reverse around corners. He was very good at it. He married in 1948. His wife's name was Margaret. They had 2 children, both daughters. He never told them about the brake technique. He never told anyone. When interviewers from the Imperial War Museum recorded oral histories of Battle of Britain pilots in the 1970s, Jimmy was never contacted. He wasn't famous. He'd only scored 3 confirmed victories. His name appeared in squadron records, but nowhere else. In 1983, a historian named Dr. Robert Fleming was researching combat tactics of the Battle of Britain when he noticed something odd in loss statistics. German fighters that had been shot down in turning engagements during August and September 1940 showed unusual damage patterns. They'd been hit from angles that shouldn't have been possible given standard Spitfire turning performance. Fleming began interviewing surviving pilots. Eventually, he found someone who remembered hearing about Harlow's cheat. That led him to 234 squadrons records. That led him to Nottingham. Fleming interviewed Jimmy in his small house in Beeston, Nottingham, in November 1983. Jimmy was 66 years old. He'd recently retired from teaching driving. He remembered the brake technique immediately, but seemed surprised anyone cared. It wasn't anything special, he told Fleming. Just something that made sense at the time. Lots of pilots did it. I just happened to try it first. Fleming asked how many pilots might have used the technique. Jimmy thought for a moment. Maybe 50? Maybe 100? Hard to say. We didn't keep records of that sort of thing. Fleming asked if Jimmy had any idea how many pilots might have survived because of the tighter turning radius. Jimmy shook his head. No way to know. Maybe none. Maybe dozens. Maybe just me. James Harlow died on March 14, 1998, at the age of 81. The obituary in the Nottingham Post mentioned his service with the RAF during the war, but included no details. It mentioned his work as a driving instructor. It mentioned his 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. There was no mention of the brake technique, no mention of the pilots he'd saved, no mention of the Messerschmitts he'd shot down using a method that shouldn't have worked. In 2003, a small display was installed at the RAF Museum Hendon. It featured a Spitfire Mark I in 234 squadrons colours. The placard mentioned several pilots who'd flown with the squadron, including James Harlow. The placard did not mention the brake technique. The technique itself disappeared from RAF doctrine immediately after the war. Modern fighter jets don't have mechanically operated landing gear brakes that can be used in flight. The specific circumstances that made Jimmy's innovation useful, sustained turning fights between aircraft with similar performance, essentially vanished with the development of missiles and jet engines. But in those desperate weeks of August and September 1940, when Britain stood alone and the mathematics of aerial combat killed pilots every day, a short coal merchant's son from Nottingham figured out something nobody else had thought of. He figured it out by remembering what he'd learned driving trucks through narrow alleys when he was 15 years old. He violated regulations. He risked a court-martial. He did it anyway because his best friend had died following the rules, and he never asked for recognition because, in his mind, he'd just done what anyone would have done. He'd tried something new. It worked. Other pilots copied it. That was all. The official history of the Battle of Britain doesn't mention James Harlow. It doesn't mention the brake technique. It mentions radar and tactics and the courage of the few. But somewhere in the unrecorded margins of that battle, in the frantic turning fights over Kent and Sussex, dozens of pilots did something that shouldn't have worked. They hit the brake at exactly the right moment. Their Spitfires turned tighter than they should have, and they lived. If this story moved you, we need your help to keep it alive. Hit that like button to show YouTube that real history matters. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another forgotten story of World War II courage and innovation. And tell us in the comments, did your family serve in the war? Do you have a connection to the RAF or the Battle of Britain? We love hearing your stories. These heroes can't speak for themselves anymore, but we can speak for them. Thanks for keeping their memory alive. October 3rd, 1940. 2:17 p.m., 6,000 feet above Maidstone, Kent. Squadron leader John Sample was going to die in approximately 90 seconds, and he knew it with absolute mathematical certainty. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 on his tail was piloted by someone who understood energy management better than Sample did. Every time Sample tried to turn, the German anticipated it. Every time Sample tried to dive away, the German cut the angle and closed the distance. Sample's radio crackled. "Red leader, you've got one on your 6. Can't shake him." That was Flight Lieutenant Collins, 400 feet below, engaged with his own targets. No help coming. Sample was alone with a German pilot who was better than him, and the mathematics said this ended only one way, unless Sample did something that violated every combat doctrine he'd ever taught. He reached for the brake lever. The story of how Jimmy Harlow's brake technique spread through fighter command is not the story most people know. The official histories mention improved tactics, better coordination, enhanced training. They don't mention the underground network of pilots who taught each other forbidden techniques in the air during combat, because waiting for official approval meant dying. By early October 1940, the brake technique had reached a critical threshold. It wasn't just a few maverick pilots anymore, it was squadron leaders, flight commanders, the men responsible for training new pilots and maintaining discipline. And that created a problem nobody had anticipated. Squadron leader John Sample commanded 504 Squadron, based at Hendon. Sample was 31 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards, and had been flying since 1929. He'd learned to fly on biplanes, had transitioned through every generation of RAF fighters, and prided himself on doing everything by the book. The book said you didn't use brakes in flight, but the book also said you didn't get shot down if you could avoid it. Sample had first heard about the brake technique on September 8th. During a briefing at 11 Group headquarters, Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory had been furious, describing it as reckless improvisation that endangers pilots and aircraft. Sample had nodded along, agreeing completely. Then, on September 12th, Sample had watched Flight Lieutenant Robert Doe from 238 Squadron use the technique to turn inside 2 Messerschmitts simultaneously. Doe had shot down both German fighters in 14 seconds. Sample had been close enough to see the whole thing. The sharp yaw as Doe hit the brake, the Messerschmitts overshooting, the brief burst of gunfire that ended both fights. Sample returned to Hendon that night and didn't sleep. He kept replaying what he'd seen. The regulations were clear, no brake usage in flight, but the results were also clear. Doe was alive, and 2 German pilots were dead. On September 15th, the climactic day of the Battle of Britain, though nobody knew it at the time, 504 Squadron intercepted a massive formation of German bombers over London. Sample led his squadron into the attack, following doctrine, making textbook passes at the bombers. Flight Sergeant Ray Holmes, flying on Sample's wing, broke doctrine. Holmes saw a Dornier bomber about to drop its load over Victoria Station. Instead of making another gun pass, Holmes used the brake technique to tighten his turn impossibly sharp, came around 180 degrees in what should have been a physically impossible maneuver, and rammed the Dornier head-on. Both aircraft fell from the sky. The Dornier crashed near Victoria Station. Holmes bailed out and survived, landing in a dustbin in Chelsea. The bombing run was disrupted. Dozens, maybe hundreds of civilians survived because of Holmes's decision. Sample had seen the entire thing from 3,000 feet above. He'd seen Holmes use the brake to make a turn that shouldn't have been possible. He'd seen the result. That night, Sample called an unofficial meeting of his flight commanders. 6 men in a requisitioned cottage 2 miles from the airfield. No official minutes. No witnesses beyond the 6 pilots. Sample told them about the brake technique. He explained the physics as he understood them. He told them about the official prohibition. Then he told them about what he'd seen Holmes do. "I'm not ordering anyone to try this," Sample said, "but I'm not stopping you either. If you want to practice it, do it away from the field. Don't tell me about it, don't document it, but if it saves your life or someone else's life, I want you to know about it." Flight Lieutenant Michael Constable, a 24-year-old from Somerset, spoke up. "Sir, are you saying we should violate regulations?" "I'm saying," Sample replied carefully, "that regulations are written by people who aren't being shot at. You need to make your own decisions about what keeps you alive." This was sedition. This was a squadron leader explicitly encouraging his pilots to ignore official doctrine. If anyone reported this conversation, Sample would be court-martialed. Nobody reported it. Over the next 2 weeks, every pilot in 504 Squadron learned the brake technique. They practiced it in pairs during supposedly routine patrols, always out of sight of the airfield. The ground crews noticed the increased wear on the brake assemblies but said nothing. They simply reinforced the systems on their own time, using spare parts scrounged from damaged aircraft. The technique was harder to master than Jimmy Harlow had made it look. Flight Lieutenant Dennis David nearly spun his Spitfire into the Thames on his 3rd attempt. Pilot Officer John Gurchin locked up his brake completely and had to land with one wheel frozen, tearing up 200 feet of runway. Flying Officer Eric Mars got the timing wrong and induced a high-speed stall that took 4 feet to recover from. But they kept practicing because the alternative was following the regulations, and the regulations got you killed. By October 3rd, Sample himself had practiced the technique 17 times. He'd never used it in combat because he'd never needed to. Sample was a good pilot, cautious and technical. He survived by being smarter than the enemy, not by taking risks. Then he met a German pilot who was smarter than him. The fight started over Maidstone. Sample's squadron had been vectored to intercept a raid of Ju-88 bombers. The bombers turned out to be a feint. A dozen Bf-109s dropped out of the sun just as 504 Squadron committed to the attack. The neat formation dissolved instantly. Sample found himself alone, diving away from the ambush, with a single Messerschmitt locked onto his tail. The German pilot was patient. He didn't waste ammunition on low-percentage shots. He stayed 400 yards back, matching Sample's every move, waiting for the fatal mistake. Sample tried everything in the book. He rolled, dove, climbed, jinked left and right. Nothing worked. The German anticipated every maneuver. Sample could feel the distance slowly closing. 400 yards, 380, 360. His fuel gauge showed 15 minutes remaining. The German could wait him out if necessary. Sample's hands were slick on the control column. His mouth was dry. He could hear his own breathing, harsh and rapid inside the oxygen mask. The mathematics were absolutely clear. In 90 seconds, maybe less, he would be in the German's gun range, and the German wouldn't miss. Sample rolled into a hard left turn. Standard procedure. The Spitfire settled into her natural turning circle. Sample felt the German pilot relax slightly behind him, recognizing the familiar pattern. Then Sample hit the left brake. The Spitfire's nose whipped left with shocking violence. The turn tightened by nearly 30 degrees in less than a second. Sample's vision tunneled from the G-forces, but he held the brake for exactly 3/4 of a second, the timing he'd practiced 17 times, before releasing and adding full throttle. The Messerschmitt flashed past his left wing, less than 150 yards away. The German pilot had completely misjudged the turn rate. For 2 perfect seconds, the Bf 109 was directly ahead, crossing from left to right, slightly nose down as the German pilot tried to correct. Sample fired. The Hispano cannons hammered. He saw strikes on the Messerschmitt's wing root, saw pieces of metal tear away, saw smoke erupt from the engine cowling. The Bf 109 rolled right, trailing black smoke, and dove toward the ground. Sample didn't follow. He was alone in the sky, shaking so badly he could barely hold the stick, but alive. When Sample landed at Hendon 20 minutes later, his ground crew chief, Flight Sergeant William Barnes, met him at the dispersal. Barnes took one look at Sample's face and knew what had happened. "The brake, sir?" Barnes asked quietly. Sample nodded. "Good," Barnes said. "About bloody time." That night, Sample filed his combat report. Under tactics employed, he wrote, "Standard turning engagement, applied aggressive rudder input to tighten turn radius at critical moment. Enemy aircraft failed to anticipate maneuver." He didn't mention the brake. Nobody reading the report would understand what aggressive rudder input actually meant. But every pilot who'd practiced the technique would know exactly what Sample had done. The coded language spread. Aggressive rudder input, enhanced turn rate through asymmetric drag, non-standard maneuvering technique. The official reports were full of these euphemisms, hiding the brake technique in plain sight. Fighter Command knew. Of course Fighter Command knew. Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory knew. Air Chief Marshal Dowding knew. They read every combat report. They saw the statistics, lower loss rates, higher victory counts, German pilots reporting impossible Spitfire turning performance. But the official prohibition remained in place because removing it would require admitting that regulations had been wrong, that pilots had been dying because of overly cautious doctrine, that innovation from the bottom had saved the day while leadership had said no. So the fiction continued. The regulations said no brakes in flight. The pilots used brakes in flight. Everyone pretended not to notice. In November 1940, Pilot Officer Geoffrey Wellham from 92 Squadron wrote a letter to his sister describing a combat engagement. The letter was intercepted by military censors. All mail was censored during the war and flagged for review because Wellham had described using a special turning trick in combat. The letter made its way up the chain of command until it reached Group Captain Victor Beamish, who commanded the Kenley sector. Beamish called Wellham into his office. Wellham expected a court-martial. Instead, Beamish asked, "Does it work?" "Yes, sir," Wellham said. "How often?" "Maybe 7 times out of 10, sir, if you time it right." Beamish considered this. "Then don't write about it in letters home. Don't talk about it on the ground. But if it keeps you alive, keep doing it." That was as close to official approval as anyone ever got. By December 1940, the immediate crisis of the Battle of Britain had passed. The Luftwaffe had shifted to night bombing. Daylight fighter combat became less frequent. The brake technique became less necessary. But the pilots who'd learned it never forgot it. They carried it with them to other squadrons, other theatres, Malta, North Africa, Italy, Wherever Spitfires fought, the technique spread through informal channels, a quiet conversation in the mess, a demonstration during a training flight, a whispered tip before a mission. Flight Lieutenant Brian Kingcome used it over Malta in 1941, turning inside an Italian Machi C-202 that should have had the advantage. Pilot Officer Neville Duke used it over North Africa in 1942, outturning a Bf-109F in a fight that should have killed him. Squadron leader Johnny Johnson used it over France in 1943, though by then he'd refined the technique to include throttle manipulation that made it even more effective. None of them ever received official training. None of them ever appeared in doctrine manuals. The technique remained a ghost in the official records, present in results, absent in explanation. In March 1943, a Luftwaffe intelligence report analyzed combat losses over Western Europe. The report noted, British Spitfire pilots have developed turning capabilities that exceed aircraft specifications, mechanism unknown, recommend avoidance of sustained turning engagements. The German analysts never figured out the brake trick. They assumed it was a modification to the aircraft, perhaps enhanced ailerons or a new wing design. They never considered that it might be something as simple as using the landing brake at precisely the right moment. Squadron leader John Sample survived the war. He was promoted to wing commander in 1942 and spent the rest of the war training new pilots at an operational training unit in Scotland. He taught standard doctrine. He never mentioned the brake technique in any official capacity. But occasionally, during one-on-one training flights with pilots he trusted, Sample would demonstrate something he called maximum rate turning under emergency conditions. He never explained exactly what he was doing. He'd just say, "Watch carefully, you might need this someday." Some pilots figured it out, some didn't. Sample never confirmed or denied anything. After the war, Sample left the RAF and became a commercial pilot for BOAC. He flew passenger routes to Africa and Asia for 20 years. He retired in 1965, settled in Cornwall, and rarely spoke about the war. In 1979, Dr. Robert Fleming, the same historian who would later interview Jimmy Harlow, tracked Sample down for an oral history project. Sample was 69 years old, living in a small cottage near St. Ives. Fleming asked about the brake technique. Sample was silent for almost a full minute. Then, "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "Sir, I have combat reports that reference your use of enhanced turning techniques. I've interviewed pilots who served under you. They say you taught them something that saved their lives." Another long silence. Finally, "If I did teach them something, it was this. Regulations are guidelines, not suicide pacts. A pilot who's afraid to think for himself is already dead." "Did you violate orders, sir?" "I followed the orders that made sense. I ignored the ones that didn't." "Did that bother you? The contradiction?" Sample smiled slightly. "Every single day. But I preferred living with the contradiction to dying with a clear conscience." John Sample died in 1987 at the age of 77. His obituary mentioned his distinguished flying cross, his service commanding 504 Squadron, and his post-war career with BOAC. It did not mention the brake technique. It did not mention the pilots who'd learned from him. It did not mention the quiet rebellion he'd led against regulations that killed people. The brake technique itself became obsolete with the development of jet fighters. Modern aircraft don't have mechanically linked landing brakes that can be used for maneuvering. Fly-by-wire systems and thrust vectoring provide far more sophisticated options for manipulating an aircraft's flight path. But the principle Sample understood, that survival sometimes requires thinking beyond doctrine, never became obsolete. In 2008, the RAF Museum at Hendon opened a new exhibit on the Battle of Britain. The exhibit included a section on innovation under fire, featuring various technical and tactical developments from 1940. The display mentioned improved radio communications, better radar integration, enhanced ammunition types. It mentioned nothing about brakes. In a small footnote, barely visible in the corner of one display panel, there was a single sentence. RAF pilots developed numerous informal tactical techniques during combat operations, many of which remain undocumented in official records. That was the closest the official history ever came to acknowledging what had actually happened. If you found this chapter as compelling as the last, we need your continued support. Hit that like button to help these forgotten stories reach more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're uncovering more of these hidden moments every week, and tell us in the comments. What do you think about pilots who broke the rules to survive? Was Sample right to encourage his squadron to violate regulations? Would you have done the same? We want to hear your perspective on these impossible ethical choices. Thanks for staying with us. Thanks for keeping these complicated truths alive.